The torture of pregnant slaves was far more barbaric than you think. You wouldn't come across it in the movies. It won't be on prints. But deep in the shadows of American slavery, there was a cruelty that's so unspeakable. Of all beings, pregnant women. They weren't spared. Their wombs became weapons. Their pain fell on deaf ears. She was 9 months pregnant when they tied her to the whipping post. Her back is bare and her belly swollen. No one asked her name. No one cared. To them, she wasn't a woman. She was property, damaged, disobedient, and due for correction. The overseer raised the whip, not in hesitation, but with precision. He knew where to hit to cause the most pain. Her scream cut through the humid air, but the lash came again, and again, and again. She begged them to stop, not for herself, but for the child inside her. It didn't matter. Her body was not her own. Her pregnancy didn't spare her. In fact, it made her more of a target, because a pregnant slave was more valuable, and a defiant one even more dangerous. They dug a pit in the dirt to protect her unborn, not out of mercy, but profit. Her stomach hung over the hole as her back was flayed open. She lost blood. She lost breath. But she didn't lose the baby. Not yet. This wasn't an isolated act. This was routine, quiet, systemic, generational. Enslaved women were tortured not despite being pregnant, but because they were. It was a message. Nothing, not even life inside you, protects you here. And still history shrugs. School books skip the cruelty. Films fade to black before the screams begin. Museums display shackles, but not stories. Not the kind that turns your stomach. Not the kind that makes you question everything. But it happened. She existed. She was real. And so was her suffering. This is not the version of slavery they teach you, because if they did, you might finally understand the depth of the wound, and they're afraid of what you do with that truth. She wasn't seen as a woman, not a daughter, not a wife, not a mother. She was livestock with a womb, nothing more. Enslaved women were valued by one brutal metric: how many children they could produce. Their worth wasn't tied to who they were, but to how many more bodies they could bring into the system. Plantation owners didn't hide it. They recorded pregnancies in ledgers alongside crop yields and equipment costs. A pregnant slave was a double investment, one body working the fields, another on the way to replace her, or be sold for cash. She was praised for her fertility, but punished for any sign of resistance. Refusing to conceive? That was defiance. Miscarrying? That was a loss of property. Getting pregnant wasn't a miracle, it was a mandate. There were no choices, no partners, no tenderness. Some were forced to sleep with men they didn't know, sometimes even their own relatives, just to keep the numbers rising. If she gave birth, no one would congratulate her. There was no celebration, only calculation. If the child died, the planter lost money. If she died, they just found another. She could be raped by the same man who whipped her, then sold while still bleeding, then blamed for breaking down. This wasn't incidental. This was designed, a system where her ability to create life was used to destroy her spirit. She walked, worked, gave birth, and bled, all under ownership, and yet in every textbook her face is missing, her name erased, her story reduced to a line about population growth on southern plantations. But behind that phrase was a woman, alive, breathing, hurting. She wasn't property. She just lived in a world that treated her like she was. They call them plantations, but in many places they were nothing more than breeding farms. No cotton, no tobacco, just women, selected, paired, and violated for one purpose: to produce more slaves. The goal wasn't love. It wasn't family. It was numbers, bodies, labor, profit. White men, often the same ones preaching Christian values on Sunday, ran these operations like livestock farms. They chose which men would mate with which women. Sometimes the women were forced to sleep with multiple men, sometimes with their own sons. There was no dignity, no humanity, just forced conception on demand. The women didn't sleep in beds, they slept in fear, not of the dark, but of the next knock on the door, the next order, the next violation. And when the babies came, there were no lullabies, just counting, just weighing, just preparing them for the auction block. Every birth added to the master's wealth. A girl, future breeder. A boy, future laborer. Either way, the child was marked for a life of chains before it could take its first step. And the mothers, they weren't thanked, they weren't healed. They were expected to get back up and do it again and again and again. This wasn't an exception. It was an industry, yet history wraps it in polite terms. Natural increase, slave reproduction, domestic expansion. Euphemisms that mask rape, torture, and forced pregnancies. They want you to believe slavery was just field work and cotton sacks. But behind the myths were sweat-soaked rooms, crying women, and children born not into families, but into bondage. This was not the survival of a people. This was mass production of pain. And America profited from every scream. She didn't have a voice. She wasn't allowed one. On the plantation, the master's word was law, and her body was under that law. When he wanted her, he took her. There were no questions, no discussions, no choices. It wasn't passion. It wasn't a desire. It was power. Many enslaved women were impregnated this way, violated in silence, then left to carry the consequences. Most lived isolated, either separated from their families or deliberately moved around to prevent connection. They were alone by design, easier to control, easier to use. And when one resisted, when she dared to fight back, to scream, to say no, that's when the real violence began. Whipped while pregnant, locked in a hot shed for days, starved until her body gave in. Some were hung from trees by their arms until they miscarried. Others were punished in front of the entire plantation, humiliated and broken, their swollen stomachs exposed for all to see. There were no exceptions. Mid-pregnancy, it didn't matter. She wasn't seen as a mother-to-be, she was seen as defiant. And the system had one answer for disobedience: pain. Even the children she carried weren't spared. If they were born, they were often sold. If she had too many miscarriages, she was labeled useless and discarded. Her trauma wasn't acknowledged, it was weaponized. And still she endured. Not because she was free, but because she wasn't allowed to fall apart. This wasn't about lust or love, it was about control. Total, merciless control. A world where saying no didn't mean defiance, it meant punishment. A world where escape wasn't a place, it was a prayer. And for most, it never came. Pregnancy was supposed to be a shield, a sacred stage of life, but for enslaved women it painted a target on their bodies. The larger the belly, the more brutal the punishment. Her unborn child wasn't spared, it was part of the violence. When a pregnant woman was accused of disobedience, the overseers didn't hold back. Some were forced to lie face down in trenches, holes dug not out of mercy, but out of method. Their stomachs hung in the space, exposed and vulnerable, while their backs were ripped open by the whip. Others weren't given that small cruelty. They were beaten standing, their bellies in full view, with lashes that crossed from spine to stomach. Blood soaked into the soil long before the baby ever had a chance to breathe. Why so much cruelty? Why strike where life was forming? Because it sent a message to every other enslaved woman watching. Even your womb isn't safe here. Even the life inside you isn't yours to protect. This wasn't random. It was policy. It was a performance. Public punishment worked like theater. Pain became a warning, and nothing warned louder than watching a mother-to-be scream for 2 lives, not 1. If she miscarried, they didn't weep. They counted it as lost profit and blamed her. If the child lived, it would grow up with a mother whose body bore the scars of carrying them. The belly should have been sacred, but under slavery it was turned into a weapon used against the woman, the child, and everyone who dared imagine freedom. The punishment wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. It told her she wasn't just owned, she and everything inside her could be destroyed at will. She was laid on a table, not in a hospital, but in a shed. No anesthesia, no consent, no comfort, just cold instruments, sharp pain, and the cold gaze of men who saw her not as human, but as a test subject. Enslaved pregnant women were the invisible backbone of early American medicine. Their bodies were studied, cut open, stitched, and sliced, all in the name of science. Doctors like J. Marion Sims, celebrated today as pioneers in gynecology, built their reputations by experimenting on enslaved black women. He performed surgeries on them repeatedly without pain relief, convinced that black women didn't feel pain like white women. That lie became medicine's foundation. Pregnancy didn't protect them, it made them more desirable subjects. Their reproductive systems were poked, prodded, and tampered with while they carried life inside them. If something went wrong, if the baby died, if they bled too much, it didn't matter. There were always more women, always more wombs to use. These were not accidents. These were not rare. These experiments were conducted openly, sometimes with an audience. Students watched, assistants recorded, none intervened, because science, they claimed, required sacrifice, but the only ones sacrificed were black, poor, enslaved, and pregnant. The women weren't named in the medical journals. They were called subjects, cases, specimens. Their suffering was scrubbed clean, replaced with terms like breakthrough and discovery. And the doctors? They got awards, statues, textbooks written in their honor. But the women? They got buried, their pain, their bodies, their babies, all lost to history's silence. These weren't just experiments, they were violations, performed in plain sight, justified by racism, sanitized by science. And still, medicine rarely says their names. But we should, because their pain paid for the knowledge we praise today. In the shadows of cruelty, enslaved women carved out spaces of care. They became midwives, healers, protectors, not because they were trained, but because they had to be. No doctors came when a woman went into labor. No medicine was offered, so they leaned on each other. On wisdom passed down by whispers, on rituals, herbs, and hands that had delivered dozens of children in silence. These women knew how to ease pain, how to turn breech babies, how to stop bleeding with crushed roots and steady fingers. They worked by moonlight, in slave cabins, in the woods, sometimes while still sore from beatings of their own. They risked everything. If caught helping during forbidden hours, they could be whipped. If a birth went wrong, they could be blamed. But they kept doing it, not because they were fearless, but because no one else would. They were more than midwives. They were guardians. They protected the dignity slavery tried to erase. They wiped sweat from their brows, whispered prayers in Gula, Yoruba, and broken English. They named babies before the master could. They held the dying, welcome to the living, held space for grief, even when there was no room for joy. This was resistance, not loud, not with weapons, but with hands that healed and hearts that refused to let cruelty be the only language spoken. They built secret networks, sharing knowledge, passing herbs, hiding runaway mothers. Their work didn't stop with the birth. They taught me how to swaddle, how to nurse, how to love a child the system planned to take. Their strength didn't make headlines. It didn't make history books, but it kept generations alive. In a world built to crush them, they stitched life back together, one birth, one whisper, one act of quiet defiance at a time. The first sound a newborn slave heard wasn't a lullaby. It was footsteps, boots on wood, the rustle of paper, ink scratching a name that wasn't theirs. These babies weren't welcomed into the world. They were entered into inventory. No blankets, no cribs, no quiet moments between mother and child. A newborn was lifted not into arms, but onto scales, weighed like meat, measured like cargo, then handed back only briefly, if at all. The mother, still bleeding, still shaking, was expected to return to work within days. There was no recovery, no rest, and often no baby. Some infants were taken within hours. given to wet nurses, sold to neighboring plantations, or simply disappeared in the hands of traders who didn't explain, didn't apologize, just took. There was no naming ceremony. If the child was named, it was often by the master, not the mother. Something short, easy to call in the fields. Names weren't gifts. They were tools. A mother's first act wasn't to feed or swaddle. It was to surrender, to watch a white man record her child's existence as property, a number, a future laborer, a potential breeder. Before her child could crawl, it already belonged to someone else. Some women tried to hide their babies. Some tried to run. Some tried to end it themselves, believing death was kinder than what lay ahead, because they knew the truth. These children weren't born into life. They were born into bondage, into a system that saw their birth as profit and their future as labor. The chains didn't wait. They were passed down from the womb to the wrist, inherited like a curse, inescapable, immediate. These weren't just births. They were the beginnings of ownership, and every cry was the start of a new line in a slave ledger. She held the baby close, not to cradle, but to decide. In the stillness of night, far from the eyes of the overseer, some enslaved mothers made an unthinkable choice: death over slavery, not out of cruelty, not out of madness, but out of a twisted kind of love the world would never understand. They knew what waited. They had seen their own childhood stolen, seen toddlers torn from arms, sold off like sacks of grain, seen children beaten for crying. Girls were forced to breed before they understood what their bodies even were. Boys whipped until they forgot their own names. So some mothers chose to end it before it began. They drowned their newborns in rivers, smothered them under cloth, pressed tiny chests until the crying stopped, and then they wept. Not just from grief, but from the horror of having to become both mother and executioner. White historians called it insanity. But the truth is harder. These women were not deranged. They were desperate. They believed death was the only freedom left. Some didn't stop with the child. They ended their own lives too. A final act of resistance, a refusal to feed the system with one more soul. Others prayed the baby would die on its own. From fever, from hunger, from anything that might save it from the fields, the lash, the breeding stalls. This wasn't murder, it was mercy, twisted by bondage, a love so deep it was willing to cross into darkness to protect the child from a world built on chains. These stories are rarely told. Too painful, too complex, too damning. But they happened, and they reveal a brutal truth. For some enslaved mothers, death wasn't the enemy. Slavery was. They didn't just punish her, they made sure everyone watched. On southern plantations, torture wasn't hidden. It was performed, a stage of dirt, a crowd of trembling witnesses, and at the center, a woman, sometimes pregnant, always powerless, stripped of dignity and forced to suffer under the eyes of her own people. Whippings were routine. Her cries weren't meant to be silenced. They were meant to echo. Overseers dragged women, heavy with child, into open fields, tied them to posts or trees, and lashed them in full view. The message was simple: pain is the price of disobedience, and no one is safe. Even execution wasn't off the table. Some were hanged while carrying life inside them. Others were forced to dig their own graves. Spectacle didn't just punish the body, it crushed the spirit of everyone who witnessed it. The cruelty wasn't just about control, it was about theater. Fear worked better when shared. Children were made to watch their mothers bleed. Fathers watched daughters scream. Fellow slaves were often forced to assist, holding down limbs, fetching tools, knowing they'd be next if they refused. And if the woman was pregnant, that didn't buy her mercy. It made her a more powerful warning. Her suffering represented two lives being broken at once. There was no illusion of justice. These punishments weren't for crimes, they were for asserting control, for breaking resistance before it could take root. And the audience? Silent, powerless, carrying the scars of what they saw long after the blood was washed away. This was slavery's sick ritual. pain made public, humiliation made tradition. It wasn't enough to hurt her. They needed others to see it, remember it, and fear it, because fear kept the system running, and her body was the billboard. They didn't torture pregnant women by accident. They did it because it sent the loudest message. If they could break the one carrying life, they could break everyone watching. Slavery wasn't just about labor, it was about domination of the body, the mind, and the soul. And the womb was its most strategic battlefield. It held not just one life, but the potential for many. Control that, and you control the future. By targeting pregnant women, enslavers attacked hope itself. Pain wasn't just inflicted, it was calculated. Public whippings, forced labor in late pregnancy, assaults on women already carrying the weight of new life. These weren't isolated acts of cruelty. They were tools. Weapons designed to send a message no one could ignore. Your body is not yours. Your children are not yours. Your future is not yours. This was psychological warfare, when a woman screamed in labor while picking cotton and no one came, when she was punished in front of her own children, when she gave birth knowing that baby might be sold tomorrow. That wasn't just physical suffering. That was an emotional collapse. The kind that made people stop resisting, the kind that taught silence. It broke bonds before they formed, turned mothers into machines, replaced love with fear. Because when you control the womb, you don't just own a person, you own their lineage, their legacy, their ability to dream. This wasn't chaos, it was a system built on calculated trauma, and every broken spirit was proof it worked. So they made examples of the most vulnerable, not because they were threats, but because their suffering echoed the loudest. And in that echo, others learned, you don't fight back, you survive, and even that comes at a cost. They wrote it down, in letters, journals, and whispered confessions, yet most of us never read the pages stained with tears. Enslaved women documented whippings aimed at swollen bellies, forced separations at the birthbed, and gynecological experiments performed without mercy. Their words leap from the page: the crack of the whip, the drip of blood, the shudder of milk drying in cracked breasts. These testimonies don't fit the comforting narrative of progress. They unsettle. They force us to confront the rawest edges of history. Historians often gloss over these accounts, relegating them to footnotes or appendices. Why? Because the details are too graphic, too shameful, too real. A mother recounts watching her baby snatch the moment it drew its first breath. A midwife describes tying knots of root and prayer to staunch blood until the infant died. A girl of 14 pleads for relief from repeated assault and finds none. Each story carries the weight of a suppressed truth. Slavery's atrocities didn't spare pregnancy, they weaponized it. Yet these voices demand to be heard. They bore the scars so our conscience could awaken. They risked punishment by writing, hoping someone would read. Their courage echoes, remember us, don't look away. To skim their narratives is to dismiss their pain, to let the silence prevail. We must lean in, read the unflinching details. Trace the names, Rose, Clara, Sarah, etched into the margins of whitewashed histories. Let their testimonies shatter the myths we've been fed, because only by acknowledging the full horror can we grasp the true cost of bondage. Their stories are not relics. They are living evidence of cruelty and resilience. And if we choose to ignore them, we perpetuate the erasure they fought so hard to overcome. Their voices demanded to be heard, still demanding, still waiting for us to listen. The chains didn't break. They changed form. The trauma that began in the fields, in the slave quarters, on blood-stained beds where women gave birth in pain and silence, didn't die with them. It passed down like a shadow, woven into the DNA of their descendants. What was done to their bodies didn't stay in the past. It echoed loudly, relentlessly into generations that followed. A woman whipped while pregnant didn't just carry physical scars, she carried fear, shame, rage, and those emotions became the foundation of how she mothered, how she survived, how she loved. Her child felt it, her grandchild inherited it, not through stories, but through silence, through instinct, through the unspoken weight in a mother's gaze. Generational trauma isn't abstract, it's real. It shows up in birth complications that disproportionately affect Black women today, in the inherited mistrust of doctors passed down from ancestors used as medical experiments, in the cultural pressure to be strong, unbreakable, because for centuries breaking meant death. Families were torn apart so often that even now the idea of safety can feel foreign. Love is often laced with fear, fear of loss, fear of being seen as weak, fear of not surviving. That's not coincidence. That's history living in the present. This trauma is cellular. It exists in the nervous system, in the heartbeat, in the way a Black woman today walks into a hospital and is not believed. It began with women who were owned, women who were tortured while pregnant, women who couldn't protect their babies, and though the chains are no longer visible, the damage still lingers, carried by descendants who never knew the names of those women but still feel the echo of their pain. Because trauma this deep doesn't disappear. It passes on until it's named, faced, and finally healed. They didn't forget to tell this part, they chose not to. The stories of pregnant slaves whipped until they bled, of babies born into bondage, of mothers forced to kill their own children, those were deliberately left out. Not because they weren't true, but because they were too true, too horrifying, too damning. Textbooks skim past it with vague phrases: domestic labor, natural increase, plantation life. The brutal details, the rape, the experiments, the punishment of pregnant bodies are scrubbed clean, replaced with polite language that comforts the reader and protects the legacy of those who profited. Why? Because the real history makes heroes look like monsters. It exposes America's foundation not as noble, but as soaked in blood and built on broken wombs. It forces uncomfortable questions. Who knew? Who allowed it? Who benefited? Schools don't teach it because it doesn't fit the myth. Documentaries avoid it because it disrupts the neat narrative of progress. Politicians dismiss it because it challenges the illusion that slavery is something long gone. Irrelevant. But this silence isn't neutral, it's protective. It shields the guilty and blinds the next generation. But silence doesn't erase suffering, it just buries it deeper. Every story untold is a wound, every skipped detail is a second betrayal. The women who endured this didn't survive just to be forgotten. They didn't scream through labor in the dirt or bleed under the lash for their pain to become a footnote. The silence was strategic, but remembering is resistance. Because once you know this truth, you can't unsee it. And maybe that's what they feared most, that if the full story were ever told, the entire lie would collapse, and in its place, justice might finally begin. She was never given a name in your history book, not a portrait, not a monument, just silence. But her pain was real, raw, relentless, and buried beneath centuries of denial. She carried life while being treated as less than human. She was whipped while pregnant, raped under law, forced to give birth in fields, in shacks, in chains, then forced to watch as her child was taken, sold, or killed. That's not a chapter of the past. It's the foundation of it. Her suffering didn't vanish when slavery ended. It echoed forward. In health systems that still don't believe black women's pain, in families broken before they could even form, in the silence handed down through generations because the trauma was too deep to speak aloud. She is not a symbol. She was a person, a body, a soul, a mother, a girl, a name never written, but a voice that demands to be heard, not as a victim, but as evidence. Proof of a cruelty so vast it shaped a nation and still does. Her story isn't over. It lives in disparities, in systems, in statistics, in the unease that comes when truth cuts through comfort, because you can only ignore her if you choose to. But now you know. You know what was done to her. You know why her memory was erased, and you know what it costs to stay silent. She matters. Her pain matters, not just because it happened, but because it still echoes in bloodlines, in policies, in stories still untold. To forget her is to continue the erasure. To remember her is to begin the reckoning. And now that her story is in your hands, the question is simple. What will you do with it?